Tonight, our focus is on the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Like Washington, Lincoln is a mythical figure who looms larger than life. And we couldn't ask for a better guide to Lincoln than our speaker. Frank J. Williams, founding chairman of the Lincoln Forum, is the retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Rhode Island. Judge Williams did his undergraduate work at Boston University, after which he served as an officer in the U.S. Army with tours of duty in Vietnam and Germany. After his military service, he returned to BU for law school, graduating in 1970, the same year he was admitted to the Rhode Island bar. He's practiced law in various capacities ever since, serving on the Superior Court from 1995 to 2001, and as the Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court from 2001 to 2009. He's won numerous awards and honors for his service, and is an adjunct professor at Roger Williams University of Law and the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. But in addition to his legal career, he has been a leader in the Lincoln community for over 30 years, first as president of both the Lincoln Group of Boston and the Abraham Lincoln Association. He's also a major collector of Lincolniana, a self-described peripatetic lecturer before Lincoln and Civil War groups, and a scholar who's written or edited over 14 books, including Judging Lincoln, 2002, Lincoln Lessons, 2009, and Lincoln as Hero, 2012, all from Southern Illinois University Press. He was a member of the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission and is now a board member of the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. He's also the literary editor of the Lincoln Herald, and one of his current projects, which has grown out of his collecting activity, is to update Jay Monahan's Lincoln bibliography, an attempt to enumerate every book that has ever been written about Abraham Lincoln since 1865. Just as Monahan has been the Bible for collectors and librarians for generations, I predict that Williams will be the new standard and guide to the literature as we move into the 21st century. He resides in Hope Valley, Rhode Island, with his lovely wife, Virginia. While Frank is a New Englander to the core, Virginia is a native Texan, born here in Dallas, in fact. I was fortunate this past spring to visit them in their home to see their magnificent collection. Their guest house in Rhode Island is actually a Texas cabin with a dog trot porch and barbed wire on display in the kitchen sink. All of which certainly made me feel at home. Please join me in welcoming Virginia back to the Lone Star State and in adopting our speaker tonight, Judge Wood.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Russ, for that kind introduction. As the late impresario Saul Urich said, it's so nice to hear your eulogy while you're still alive. You're doing great things here in Dallas, especially, generally, and specifically with President George W. Bush's new library and museum and the Institute, and the combination of forces, the Institute there and your Presidential Center. It's great to be here and to see so much energy. So I congratulate you. President Bush appointed me, and we can take this up in questions. I hope there will be many, but his administration, through Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and then another Texan, Secretary of Defense Gates, appointed me, and I was still the Chief Justice in Rhode Island, as one of the civilian judges for the U.S. Court of Military Review to hear appeals from Guantanamo Bay. So I feel very honored to have served again our country, as I do believe that this President Bush, 43, was right in his approach on the war on terror. And we celebrated yesterday, didn't we? I hope with more than a moment of silence, the horrific attacks against our country 12 years ago on September 11th. I mention this because there's another president who had to confront civil war or the war of rebellion. And That man, Lincoln, had very little experience, so they say, in being a commander-in-chief, which is in Article 2 of our Constitution. It's not even defined there. But someone like an Abraham Lincoln and later presidents, including George W. Bush and now President Obama, are further defining the war powers of the president. When he assumed the presidency in 1861, Abraham Lincoln had limited military experience, no combat experience, but in the words of historian Alan Brinkley, great presidents are products not just of their own talents and ambitions, but of the circumstances they inherit. When he took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, Lincoln inherited a country on the brink of war. As president, the United States Constitution conferred on him the powers of the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. That's right from Article 2. Powers that would define his legacy. As Theodore Roosevelt, who very much admired Abraham Lincoln and tried to emulate him and even wrote about him, he once noted, this is TR now, a man has to take advantage of his opportunities, but the opportunities have to come. If there is not the war, you don't get the great general. If there is not the great occasion, you don't get the great statesman. If Lincoln had lived in times of peace, no one would know his name now. Lincoln's first exposure to war came in 1832 when he volunteered for the Black Hawk War and served for 30 days as the elected captain of his local militia company, and 60 more as a private. He re-enlisted for 2 30-day enrollments. He was 23 years old. Lincoln, however, did not see any combat except, as he later joked, in battling pesky mosquitoes. After he was elected a captain by his New Salem friends, this is how the militia officers were selected, not necessarily on merit, but by popularity and vote of your troops. Lincoln inspired more humor than gallantry as a leader. Once, when marching his company toward a narrow gate, he forgot the proper command to form his troops into a single column so that they could advance through the gate. "Halt!" Lincoln shouted. "This company is dismissed for 2 minutes, when it will form again on the other side of the gate." In truth, Lincoln's service in the Black Hawk War should not be underestimated. The men of his Black Hawk War Company testified that their captain had shown himself, this is a quote from a diary entry years later, a kind-hearted and noble man who did his duty well without fear, gold, favor, or affection. He had a somewhat good eye for military affairs. A New Salem friend observed his heart and head were large and comprehensive enough to command a company, regiment, or other corps, spelled C-O-R-E, of men under any circumstances. His election as captain led him to reflect almost 30 years later in one of his 2 autobiographies that he wrote before the 1860 campaign for the presidency, that there was no subsequent success of his life that gave him as much satisfaction as his having been elected captain by his contemporaries. But Lincoln was a civilian by habit, experience, and vision. Yet his background served him well when he led the citizen soldiers who fought in the Civil War. It was a defining moment in his life, much like Captain Harry Truman's, artillery captain Harry Truman's during World War I. Both drew many lessons from their experiences. The most important for young Lincoln was that exuberant young men could not make the transition from civilians to soldiers overnight and would never fully transform themselves into full-time military men. He also learned that raw recruits came from a democratic culture, small d, with a high disregard for authority. Many of these civilian soldiers in the end simply could not and would not recognize the right of the military to keep them in service longer than they wished to stay. The same was true in the Confederate forces as well. Such attitude owed little or nothing to cowardice, laziness, lack of patriotism, but had a great deal to do with a cultural instinct for independence. Lincoln shared their privations, especially hunger. The military supply system worked imperfectly at best, and the soldiers often went without rations. When his men went hungry, so did he, on one occasion passing 2 days without food. Instinctively, he understood that good humor, patience, a willingness to share equally in the hardships of the privates, and an absence of self-importance were the primary basis to provide leadership and to bind the men to him. Fortunately, these characteristics were already a part of his Midwestern nature, and why Union soldiers came to love him, even when he sent them into battle with inept and incompetent commanding generals. To them, he became Father Abraham. In most wars, the American president confined the exercise of his commander-in-chief power to the selection of commanding officers without participating in the formulation of strategy. Forces of circumstance and the character of the presidents, rather than a formal conception of the power of the presidential office, worked against an expanded role. This was true in the War of 1812, but a strong and active president like James K. Polk would participate in decisions of military strategy during the war with Mexico. In the war between the states, circumstances existed which required a full exercise of the president's power as commander-in-chief. Lincoln was acutely aware of his slightness of combat experience, and he recognized the need to educate himself when he became commander-in-chief. This need was exacerbated by the severity of the war, which began almost immediately after he took office, a shortage of capable and decisive generals upon whom he could rely, and the lack of precedent, as I said earlier, defining the war powers of the commander-in-chief. For a considerable time, the war's outcome remained highly uncertain. Initially, many of the Union commanders were incompetent. Their military plans frequently miscarried, so that changes in strategy had to be swiftly devised and implemented. Abraham Lincoln, a strong and active president, had little choice but to take part in the conduct of the war, and he did so from the outset. Recognizing his deficiency, Lincoln set about mastering military strategy. His private secretary, John Hay, recalled hearing Lincoln pacing back and forth at night in his bedroom at the White House while studying books on military strategy or poring over reports from the battlefield. I call this the loneliness of command. His first major problem arose in regard to Union forts in the South. Should they be surrendered or held? If held, should men and supplies be sent to relieve and replenish the troops? Lincoln sent a relief expedition to Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor after a muddled period of preparation in which Lincoln, after failing to read orders prepared by others to be signed by him, confused the names of the warships Powhatan and Pocahontas so that the relief expedition sailed without the Powhatan. Lincoln would never again sign an order without examining it. Jefferson Davis ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to open fire, and as Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, and the war came. From the beginning, Lincoln set a pattern with regard to his constitutional powers to command. His war power would not be limited to strictly military measures. In the 10 weeks between the outbreak of Fort Sumter and the convening of Congress, Congress would not be called into session until July 4, 1861. Lincoln employed constitutional clauses to sanction measures whose extraordinary magnitude suggests but does not prove dictatorship. During the 10-week interval, Lincoln added 23,000 men to the regular army and 18,000 to the Navy. called 40,000 volunteers for 3 years' service, summoned the state militias into a 90-day volunteer force, paid $2 million from the Treasury's unappropriated funds for purposes unauthorized by Congress, closed the post office to treasonable correspondence, and imposed a blockade, an act of war, on southern ports. On April 27, 1861, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in certain parts of the country and authorized the arrest and military detention of persons who were represented to him as engaging in or contemplating treasonable practices. The president simply ignored the individual ruling, it was not a full court opinion from our Supreme Court, of longtime Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, that his action was unconstitutional. On April 20, 1861, Lincoln ordered United States Marshals to seize from the principal telegraph offices in the northern states the originals of all telegrams sent and copies of all received during the preceding year. And you think the NSA is intruding on our privacy? Lincoln did not intend to fight a rebellion with a powder puff. The ex-captain soon felt it was necessary to disregard his professional military advisors, too. Both General Winfield Scott, who headed the Army, and General Irvin McDowell, the field commander, had advised against fighting the first Battle of Manassas on the ground that more time was required for disciplining and drilling the troops. They proved to be correct. The public, however, clamored for action, and Lincoln, always in tune with political necessity, overruled the generals. The battle was fought with disastrous result. Not daunted, the following night Lincoln prepared a detailed strategy to keep the lines of communication open from Manassas to Washington, but also for federal troops to seize East Tennessee, which remained loyal to the Union. A frustrated President Lincoln sought change quickly and ordered George B. McClellan to Washington to head what became the Army of the Potomac. He subsequently accepted the proffered resignation of the aged General Winfield Scott as General-in-Chief of all the armies, and on November 1, 1861, appointed the 34-year-old McClellan to succeed Scott in that position and to serve simultaneously as commander of the Army of the Potomac. A brilliant organizer, McClellan had been immersed since the defeat at Bull Run in forming these new recruits into a well-trained army. By the autumn of 1861, the Army had grown to approximately 160,000 troops, at least 3 times as many troops as the Confederates had at Manassas. From late summer through the fall, McClellan had his men undergo long days of drills in the hope of never repeating the Manassas defeat and ignoble retreat. This was also to prepare for a Union offensive in the spring of 1862. It was a young army with soldiers mostly in their early 20s and many 19 or younger. Lincoln did not always attempt to force his tentative strategy on others. Often he bowed to the advice of his generals. Occasionally they disregarded his wishes and sometimes his direct orders. Lincoln was eager for General Don Carlos Buell to capture Cumberland Gap, through which his own grandfather and grandmother had once made their way westward. More than once, Buell promised to take this course, but in the end turned his back on the Gap and moved toward Nashville. Eventually, Lincoln took an active role in planning and overseeing the military operations of the Civil War, largely due to the incompetence of many of his early generals, but also due to his own increased knowledge of military affairs. Because of his political education, Lincoln also understood the political dimensions of military strategy. He was particularly troubled, too, by his inability to steer into action General George B. McClellan and his Army of the Potomac. In December 1861, he presented an elaborate memorandum to McClellan, which asked technical questions. They were really lawyer-like interrogatories. Remember, he was a lawyer as well as a politician. McClellan, overconfident, overbearing, returned it with penciled replies and a note rejecting all of Lincoln's suggestions. On January 27, 1862, Lincoln issued his General War Order No. 1, in which he fixed February 22, George Washington's birthday, as the day for a general movement of the land and naval forces of the United States against the insurgent forces. The Army of the Potomac and others, as well as certain naval forces, were named as ordered to be ready for a movement on that day. 4 days later, he supplemented this with President's Special War Order No. 1, commanding the Army of the Potomac, after providing for the defense of Washington, to move on February 22 to seize Manassas Junction. This was followed on February 3 by a note to McClellan insisting on Lincoln's own plan for an attack on the Confederate Army near Washington rather than an expedition by water against Richmond. However, plans, suggestions, and orders were alike ineffective to move McClellan or his army. Shortly after this, Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, of his impulse to take charge of the Army of the Potomac and see what he could do as a field commander. He did not yield to this impulse at that time or later, though on May 23, 1863, the Chicago Tribune urged him to take the field as actual commander, as did his own Attorney General, Edward Bates, from Missouri. During the week of May 5, 1862, however, in a visit to Fort Monroe at the foot of Chesapeake Bay, he did assume personal command of the operations that resulted in the capture of Norfolk. The president not only ordered the advance on Norfolk, but personally selected the place where the attack was to begin and gave the order to fire. He also countermanded the orders of the aged and inept Major General John Wool as to the disposal of some of his troops. Wool was the commanding general at Fort Monroe. Perhaps encouraged by this success, when Stonewall Jackson made one of his forays into the Shenandoah Valley, Lincoln gave specific orders to Generals McDowell, Buell, and John Fremont to surround and capture Jackson and his army. Good luck there. Fremont, and this is why, Fremont disobeyed two of Lincoln's orders, resting his men on a day when they were ordered to march and taking a different route from the one selected by Lincoln. Even if the orders had been obeyed, the capture of Stonewall Jackson's army would not have been a simple task. After this experience, Lincoln did not again attempt to direct the field movements of several armies a long distance from the White House. Now, several presidents have faced major crises, either in bringing their field generals to engage in battle or in keeping them within bounds, not simply on the battlefield, but within the framework of constitutional government. We all remember the trouble that President Truman had with General Douglas MacArthur. In fact, when President Truman decided to fire General MacArthur, he asked for books from the Library of Congress that addressed how Lincoln handled the firing of George Brinton McClellan. General McClellan, the most reluctant of field generals, proved a great trial to Lincoln in both spheres. Both in his strategic conceptions, McClellan nevertheless dreaded the actual execution of his plans. A repetitive pattern for him was to demand more reinforcements after overestimating the enemy's strength and depreciating his own. He was a wonderfully imaginative procrastinator. If he had General Robert E. Lee at a disadvantage, he almost invariably failed to exploit it. McClellan would report to his impatient superiors at Washington that he must wait until the Potomac rose to be sure that Lee would not recross it. He must finish drilling new recruits, reorganize his forces, and procure more shoes, uniforms, blankets, and camp equipment. McClellan compensated for battlefield inaction by spending his idle time pouring his irrepressible arrogance into his letters, including one to Lincoln on July 7, 1862, following his disastrous Peninsula Campaign in Virginia. It pointed out, this is the memo he handed to the commander-in-chief, it pointed out that it was high time the government established a civil and military policy to cover all of the nation's troubles, and generously informed the president precisely what that policy should be. McClellan's behavior became critical after his failure to follow up his victory at Antietam by pursuing General Lee's fleeing army. Lincoln worked mightily, as his secretary John Nicolay put it, at poking shot sticks into little Mac's ribs. When the general's ingenious excuses complained that an epidemic had afflicted his horses, with sore mouths and weary backs, Lincoln was goaded into a sharp reply by telegram. "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything?" Lincoln's administration was now at a critical juncture. Winter was approaching, and would assure that, with the exception of Antietam, the long record of Eastern defeat and stalemate would remain intact. Congress, restive with this state of affairs, was soon to convene. Governors were nervous. They're the ones charged with raising the troops, remember. The cabinet was divided, and both the extreme war and peace men were thundering against the president. Nor was Lincoln unmindful of McClellan's personal softness toward the South, and the presence on his staff of some who advocated a waiting game to prolong the war until both sides were exhausted and the Union might be preserved with slavery intact. Should he replace McClellan? Alternative generals were a sorrowfully undistinguished lot, many already scarred with failure and others abysmally inexperienced. After serious deliberation, Lincoln relieved McClellan on November 5, 1862, and appointed General Ambrose E. Burnside, a Rhode Islander, in his place. Some wag told me, if we didn't have the great General Nathanael Greene as General Washington's right-hand man, we'd be stuck with General Burnside. Upon reading the president's order, McClellan explained, "Alas for my poor country." Some of his officers even urged him to disobey the presidential order, relieving him. McClellan later wrote that he could easily have marched his troops into Washington and taken possession of the government. If so, it would have been his first successful forward movement of the war. Instead, McClellan turned over the command of his 120,000 men in an elaborate ceremony. But this was by no means the last encounter between McClellan and Lincoln. In 1864, 2 years after his removal, McClellan met Lincoln on new terrain as the Democratic nominee for the presidency. McClellan lost that battle too, but not before being offered a new command. When McClellan was seriously considered as the Democratic presidential nominee in 1864, Lincoln gave serious thought to recalling the general. Doing so would serve a dual purpose for the Republican president. It would simultaneously allow Lincoln to capitalize on McClellan's military acumen, such as it was, while eliminating his candidacy, as McClellan was still very popular. As New York Herald editor James Gordon Bennett advised a friend of the president, "Tell him to restore McClellan to the Army, and he will carry the election by default." With Union casualties mounting and the North's war weariness, McClellan's candidacy did pose a significant threat to Lincoln. And also, Lincoln believed it was in the best interest of the country to be reelected by a united North. To that end, on the eve of the 1864 election, Lincoln sent a mutual friend to see McClellan to propose that if McClellan withdrew his candidacy, Lincoln would reinstate him with a command. Questions remain as to whether it would have been an army, like the Army of the Potomac, or whether McClellan would have been appointed as general-in-chief. That would have been problematic since Lincoln had just appointed Ulysses S. Grant as the general-in-chief. McClellan never delivered a written response to the president's offer, but a draft in his papers reveals his thought process and his belief that should he abandon the call to higher office in exchange for employment as a general in the Army, he would be doing a disservice to the country. But more importantly, McClellan's notes also reflect his disfavor for Lincoln's wartime policies. "I think the war," he wrote, "has been permitted to take a course which unnecessarily embitters the inimical feeling between the two sections, and much increases the difficulty of attaining the true objects for which we ought to fight. Convinced that the Union of States should never be abandoned so long as there are hope that it can be made to secure the welfare and happiness of the people of all the states, I deprecate a policy which, far from tending to that end, tends in the contrary direction." What was he talking about here? Emancipation. He was death against Lincoln's change in war mission from reunion to reunion and freedom. As commanders-in-chief, presidents face additional tensions with the remaining governmental branches concerned with military affairs. The federal courts, with their high duty in a democratic state to protect the Constitution and the laws against encroachment. The greatest exercise of Lincoln's power as commander-in-chief was in regard to subjects which he could not delegate to any general. In occupied territory in wartime, the president believed he had the power to do what must be done. Congress thought it was their responsibility. As commander-in-chief of the Army, the president was alone the judge. It was on this theory that Lincoln proceeded. Functioning as he does in a democratic state, the president requires legal authority to pursue military purposes. In wartime, of course, the need and the quest become most compelling. Presidents in the nation's major wars have invoked two contrasting patterns of legal justification for their acts. One, the Lincolnian, asserts an expansive view of the president's independent authority based on the commander-in-chief clause of the Constitution, the one that's not defined, and on the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, the president's oath. Under this view, the president is justified in curtailing or even suppressing key liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights to safeguard the nation's imperiled safety. In such circumstances, to further the progress of the war, the president may have to set aside political and economic liberties, which in peacetime are inviolable. During his presidency, Lincoln invoked his authority under the Constitution and promulgated numerous orders and proclamations restrictive of individual liberty. Most significant and the most controversial of all of them was his suspension of the precious writ of habeas corpus in certain parts of the country, as well as his subsequent extension of the suspension of habeas corpus nationwide for persons guilty of any disloyal practice. Congress did authorize the president to do this nationwide in 1863. Lincoln's first habeas corpus proclamation, issued in the war's early weeks, was triggered by events in Maryland. In early 1861, underground resistance and open defiance were rampant in that state. Federal troops were attacked by mobs in Baltimore. Communications to the capital were severed. Bridges were burned. And the mayor and police chief were unabashedly pro-Confederate and anti-Lincoln. Newspapers were hostile to the administration, and it fanned disunion sentiment. The state legislature was soon to convene, with some of its members seeking to have the state secede from the Union. Union generals moved to nip the growing conspiracy by arresting the mayor, the chief of police, and several police commissioners. Other Marylanders were arrested, including one John Merriman, charged with various acts of treason. Merriman was languishing in Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor when the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, riding on circuit duty, ordered the body of John Merriman produced on the next day, and the cause of his capture and detention be made known. A head-on clash between the President and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, between the war and the Constitution, was in the making. Taney, to the administration's great relief, confined himself to declaring that the power to suspend the writ, which should be exercised with extreme caution, belonged to Congress and not to the President. Taney's opinion nevertheless put the administration under the cloud of the likelihood of a hostile Supreme Court decision, with the whole court sitting, an event Attorney General Edward Bates said would do more to paralyze the executive than the worst defeat our armies have yet sustained. Some of Lincoln's acts as commander-in-chief may have been questionable, some unwise, and others of doubtful constitutionality. But in retrospect, it is clear that he was, in each instance, motivated not by any thought of personal aggrandizement, but by his desire to save the Union. Taken together, they contribute greatly to that end. Lincoln himself laid no claim to military genius and frankly admitted that his interference with his commanders was partly the result of their dilatoriness and ineptitude and partly the result of political pressure. As capable commanders emerged, Lincoln interfered less and less. He became less inclined personally to direct the strategy of the various campaigns, but he became more insistent upon generals who could work out a plan of campaign and fight. Several characteristics enabled Lincoln to navigate the rocks and shoals of this war successfully. First was his patience. He was aware that he could not simply assert a policy and expect the nation to fall into line behind him. He had to maneuver cautiously, aware that the vessel he piloted was a fragile one. A coalition consisting of Republicans, war Democrats, former Whigs, and know-nothings. He knew that no individual could simply impose his will on history by virtue of his personality or persuasiveness. In promoting or dismissing generals or admirals, as in announcing a policy for the elimination of slavery, it was necessary to assess both the state of the public will and the momentum of events before making a decision, or at least before announcing a decision. Second, Lincoln was pragmatic. This extended not only to his known interest in new and even revolutionary forms of weaponry, but also to the crafting of policy. He was unwilling to be hamstrung by established doctrine or protocol. He was no scofflaw. Lincoln revered the law and especially the Constitution, but it was the Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that governments existed for the purpose of securing the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that was his secular Bible. If some new, even unprecedented approach to achieve this was available, he was willing to try it. As he wrote to Edwin D. Morgan, the governor of New York, "We are in no condition to waste time on technicalities." Finally, Lincoln succeeded not only because of his patience and his pragmatism, but because of his keen political sensitivity, his deft touch as a manager, his willingness to make a hard call and assume full responsibility for the consequences, and throughout it all, his humor and his humanity. In the beginning, hundreds of commissions were issued, many to high-ranking officers for purely political reasons, because they had powerful friends, could raise troops, or because it was desired to obtain their full support of the war. The criticism was made, not without justification, that favoritism had officered the army with incompetence. Even when such men as Democrats Benjamin Butler and George McClellan had repeatedly demonstrated their incapacity, there was long hesitation in removing them for fear of unfavorable political reaction. Butler had radical Republican friends. McClellan had Democratic admirers. Both elements were crucial to maintain the coalition in support of the war at home. After Donaldson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant had Lincoln's complete confidence, and his reply to voluble criticism of him was, "I can't spare this man, he fights." After Grant moved to Virginia, there was little interference from the president, and indeed, on no other basis could the president and his chief commander have worked together. In the latter months of the war, finding in Grant, William T. Sherman, Philip Sheridan, a triumvirate upon whom he could depend, Lincoln, while he keenly followed the movements of the armies, permitted his commanders free conduct of their own campaigns. Lincoln withheld from Grant only the decision or questions that were within the political zone, as when he instructed him to have no conference with General Robert E. Lee except for the surrender of Lee's army or upon some minor or purely military matter. All proposals for peace were to be passed on by Lincoln. Lincoln had reason to believe that sentiment in the army favored his re-election in 1864, so he was not reluctant to take advantage of this factor. No restriction was placed upon electioneering for the soldier vote, the first in our history. Leaves of absence were fully granted to officers that they might participate in the campaign. Many of them spoke at public meetings on behalf of the Lincoln-Johnson ticket. Furloughs were given privates that their influence might be felt in their home districts. Men on detached service and convalescents in hospitals were sent home to help. The situation in Indiana was a special problem, since it was the only large state whose soldier citizens could not vote in the field. It was felt that the loss of the state election in October, preceding the November general election, would be a severe blow to the Republicans. So Lincoln ordered all Indiana soldiers, either hospitalized or unfit for service, sent to their home state. Moreover, he sent from Sherman's army 6 prominent Hoosier officers, along with Major Generals John Logan and Frank Blair, to stump Indiana and nearby states. Lincoln justified this conduct just as he justified his yielding to political pressure and by granting pardons and cotton trading permits on the ground that in seeking his own re-election and strengthening the political influence of his administration, he was working not for personal gain, but for the salvation of the Union. Although Lincoln made mistakes as a war leader, he learned from them. He grew as a strategist. He asked questions. He read. He probed. He tried almost anything within his power to shorten and win the war. Ironically, it was Lincoln, a most unlikely military man, who became America's apostle of modern war. In the years of lonely responsibility, when Lincoln directed the war effort, he grew steadily in stature as a strategist. Usually he displayed greater strategic insight than most of his commanders, but he was willing, as he had been earlier, to yield the power to frame and control strategy to any general who demonstrated that he could do the job, if he could find the general. By 1864, both he and the nation were certain that they had found the man, Ulysses S. Grant. And in that year, the United States finally achieved a modern command system to fight a modern war. Lincoln's most important legacy as a strategist was his establishment of the modern command system. A commander-in-chief, Lincoln, to establish overall strategy, a general-in-chief, Grant, to implement plans, and a chief of staff, Major General Henry Halleck, to relay information. Under this new system, a joint product of both Lincoln and the Congress, Ulysses S. Grant was named General-in-Chief, charged with the function of planning and directing the movement of all Union armies. Because he disliked the political atmosphere in Washington, Grant established his headquarters with the Army in the Eastern Theater, but did not technically command that Army of the Potomac. That was under the command of General George Gordon Meade. In the new arrangement, Halleck received a new office, Chief of Staff. He was not, however, a Chief of Staff in today's sense of the term. Primarily, he was a channel of communication between Lincoln and Grant, and between Grant and the 17 departmental commanders under Grant. The perfect office soldier, he had found at last his proper niche. Lincoln, as president, would be the commander-in-chief. As general-in-chief, Grant justified every belief Lincoln had in his capacities. He possessed in superb degree the ability to think of the war in overall terms. But his grand plan of operations that ended the war was at least partly Lincolnian in concept. Grant conformed his strategy to Lincoln's known ideas, hit the Confederacy from all sides with pulverizing blows, and make enemy armies, not cities, his main objective. The general submitted the broad outlines of his plan to Lincoln, and the president, trusting in Grant, approved the design without seeking to know the details. The 1864 command system embodied the brilliance of simplicity. It contained elements that later would be studied by military leaders and students in many nations. Abraham Lincoln, without fully realizing his part, had made a large and permanent contribution to the story of command organization. While Lincoln may never have read Karl von Clausewitz's famous treatise on war, his actions were consistent with Clausewitz's central argument. The political objective is the goal. War is the means of achieving it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. Therefore, it is clear that war should never be thought of as something autonomous, but always as an instrument of policy. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were all forced to adapt based on the hard realities of their circumstances. In the Iraq War, it took several years of uncertainty before President George W. Bush reassessed and also readapted. The result was the surge. Historian T. Harry Williams from Louisiana State University got it almost right when he asserted that by 1862, Lincoln became not only a better military strategist than any of his generals, perhaps save Ulysses S. Grant, but also that he was our greatest wartime president. Not bad. Not bad for a man whose only military experience was a 3-month battle with mosquitoes. Thank you all very much. I think we have some time for questions. Russell?
We do.
Yes, Talmadge.
With respect to Lincoln's invoking the law of necessity, particularly early in the war to save the Union, is it your perception that there's an overwhelming consensus among constitutional scholars that that was in fact constitutional, or is it your perception that there today is a split of authority as to whether his conduct was constitutional?
Well, in this democracy and republic of ours, there'll always be a split. But I think it's an excellent question, Talmadge, because I think the general sense, the consensus is that Lincoln did what he had to do under the rule of necessity, military necessity, and he was justified in doing it because somehow inherently they trust Lincoln. They trust Lincoln as intellectually honest, so that when the war was ending, he would give up these strident actions, these conduct that he was engaged in. And I don't want to get into a political argument here. There's a great divide over what Lincoln did and what, for example, what President Johnson did in Vietnam, or what President George W. Bush did to invade Iraq to bring Saddam Hussein down. They make a distinction that Lincoln could do what he did because that was a just war. But what George W. Bush did was not a just war, although the Bush administration, and I think very ably, defended the just war concept for taking on Iraq or Afghanistan or both. So there's an ongoing dispute, but it's more then and now that's really driving this. Someone else. Yes?
Isn't the real difference that Lincoln was fighting a civil war, a rebellion? I mean, that never seems to be front and center of the risk to the nation is so much greater. That would justify
Yes?
actions that would not be justified in some other case.
The question is isn't the difference that we were fighting a civil war? It certainly was. It was a survival of the nation or splitting us asunder. And we were at great risk. But aren't we at great risk now with the wars on terror? With over 40 cell groups, terrorist groups. You just go to their websites and you can see what their mission is, to destroy us. Now, I say that because we know it's true. And they've already caused great damage. And what concerns many of us, historians, lawyers, judges, and just plain thinking American citizens, is that if these terrorists, or any small group of them, obtain a nuclear, chemical, or biological device, the casualties that would ensue would exceed the 750,000 from the American Civil War. That's the threat. Someone else. Come on, you must have some questions. Where's Richard when we need him, Talmadge? Yes.
Well, I'm not sure how to ask this question, but did most of the people who died in the Civil War actually die of disease, not so much gunshots?
I think the question is, most of the casualties in the Civil War were from disease and not from gunshot. That's exactly right. We lived in a time without a real strong medical knowledge of sepsis or bacteria or infection, with no drugs to really treat these kind of diseases that killed many in winter camp, both North and South. And I'm sad to report to you that only recently, through studying census data, some historians have changed the casualty that's long been accepted for decades of 620,000 in the war, North and South, to 750,000, which is an amazing number. And if we were to translate that on a per capita basis, from then to today's population, it would be in excess of 7 million. It's a big number. Yes?
Let me ask another question. With respect to the military component of the Emancipation Proclamation, that it came down as a based upon the need for military necessity, what are the statistics you hear about? Were any African American slaves in fact freed, or were they allowed to run away without fear of breaking the law, whatever? How many African American soldiers signed up to become soldiers and fought to fortify the number in the Union Army? Because you hear that, and I don't know what the numbers are.
Well, a lot. One of the reasons, and let's not kid ourselves, one of the reasons for Lincoln's issuing let's say the final proclamation on January 1, 1863, was to recruit African Americans. And what happened then was the enlistment of 200,000, roughly, we don't have the exact number, but 200,000 what was called U.S. colored troops, and some went into the Navy, although the Navy was already recruiting free blacks even before the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a big number. to help the Union war effort. And we figure, Edna Green Medford, who's a friend who teaches at Howard and has done some work on this, that of the 200,000, there were 50,000 casualties by these, that sustained by these U.S. colored troops. So it was substantial. So Lincoln, when many politicians in the North were pleading to Lincoln to back down from emancipation to ensure his re-election, Lincoln, although, concerned about this and fearing that he would lose, said, look, they're fighting for us. Why should I do that? The promise having been made must be kept. And he would refuse to back down from emancipation. Of course, we all know the history. And this happens in every generation in warfare, is sudden military victories brought good things for him. Sherman capturing Atlanta, Sheridan in the Shenandoah, the capture of Mobile Bay by Farragut in August, all helped the president's re-election efforts. Yes.
As I read Lincoln, he fought the Civil War to save the Union, and emancipation was a byproduct.
Well, thank you, but I think I said in my paper, or did say with Talmadge or another, I think I did mention, the initial goal of the administration, there's no question, was reunion. There came a point, though, within the first year of the war, that Lincoln understood that he could not win the war without emancipation. So, and this happens very seldom during conflict. The mission or the objectives of the war changed from reunion to reunion and freedom. There's no question about that. The fact that he pushed forward with the preliminary and final proclamation, which was only intended to cover those still occupied areas by the Confederacy, turned into pressing in the 1864 Republican platform the 13th Amendment. That's even when Lincoln expected to lose. So the whole mission, the whole operation was more than just became more than just reunion.
And the other part of that is subsequently we've been involved in wars, possibly considered civil wars. And what will be the byproduct of our activities if there is a byproduct of our involvement in other communities?
I have no idea. And this is why it's of great concern to all of us. And it will depend, won't it, on the leadership that we have or don't have in the White House and Congress and in the Supreme Court as well. Because when we talk about the war on terror, which we just mentioned earlier, it was the Supreme Court that really, along with the Congress, that dealt with the actions of President George W. Bush after 9/11. So all three branches of government are supposed to be involved in this dialogue and decision-making. Yes?
It seems to me that a lot of the laws relating to non-involvement of the military in domestic activities came in the 1880s as a result of the experience of the Civil War and what took place with the military. So after that, then they passed a number of the laws to try to keep the military out of domestic activities in the 1880s. And very little is made of how those laws were passed based on the actual experience in the U.S. of what the military was doing.
That's a good point. The point is that our country passed laws to prevent our military from getting involved in domestic conflict or domestic laws that would be left to the local authorities. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act. And it's still on the books now that we can't use our military for strictly domestic violence or activity. Although there have been some exceptions to that when they call up the National Guard, right? Yes.
Thank you. me out with something. Because of the timing of the Emancipation Proclamation, was it not only the northern slaves who truly were freed at that time? How did that get extended then into the rest of the country when we united with them?
Well, you're right. The Emancipation Proclamation, according to Lincoln, which he issued as a military measure, as commander-in-chief, only would be effective on those areas still under the control of the Confederacy. So how did that work? First of all, it sent a loud message to those still enslaved in those Confederate areas, because you were really getting freed once the Union Army and Navy were advancing. They ran. They now saw that there was a government in Washington that was adopting a policy of emancipation. So that's the self-emancipation part of it. The second combat part of it, as the Union armies and navies advanced, it freed those slaves that they came upon in farms and plantations and so on. We figure that was about 50,000. It also had the practical effect of freeing finally those former slaves in Union-held territory. They weren't going to be sent back. They weren't going to be sent back. And Congress passed a law that said you do not return fugitive slaves. So it had the practical effect of beginning this process of freedom. Now, why did Lincoln, and this bothers many people, why did Lincoln's proclamation only cover the areas still under the control of the Confederacy? Because our Constitution, until the 13th Amendment, which wasn't passed until December of 1865, still allowed slavery. Even though it never mentions the word slavery, when you get the 3/5 clause giving those states that had slaves 3/5 more votes for congressmen, you still had the fugitive slave law that was in there. So the Constitution, until it was changed, protected slavery. And Lincoln felt that he did not have the power to unilaterally change the Constitution. He also was concerned because this Chief Justice Roger Taney that you heard me mention, who was very pro-South, that he was very afraid even if the Emancipation Proclamation was appealed in the federal courts, that the Taney Court, the Supreme Court, headed by Taney, would find it unconstitutional. In fact, we believe that Chief Justice Taney had a memorandum in his desk drawer so stating, pending an appeal of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't happen, but there was concern about it going to the Supreme Court. Someone? Yes, Jack.
Lincoln was noted his characteristic of compassion and so kind-hearted. Now, how did that play to the advantage or disadvantage in the waging Civil War?
Jack Waugh, great author, asked a tough question. Like, how did Lincoln's compassion and empathy play during the war? And I think it was a controlling effect on how he kept his sanity by being able to weigh all of those challenges as the commander-in-chief and chief magistrate. And in his handling of people, especially in issuing pardons, for example, of sleeping sentinels, but going forward with the hanging of slave traders, I think it had a great deal to do with his makeup of character, Jack, as I think you do too. It also contributed, this empathy and sympathy, to what I call Lincoln's political courage. He had self-confidence in his belief. He believed in what he was doing, and while he made mistakes in judgment, they were not really mistakes of his confidence, self-confidence. Secondly, he believed in character, honor, and selflessness. Thirdly, he believed in sticking to a decision once it was made. And lastly, he was most alive in the midst of a fray. Despite his fatigue and his overwork, he was energized by the challenges of leading the Union during this, or he thought the whole country, because he never conceded that the seceded states, so-called, that's what he called the Confederacy, so-called, had really left the Union. So I think it underlies his whole conduct. Yes.
And how do you think the situation after the war might have proceeded should Lincoln have lived?
That question about what would have happened with Reconstruction if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated is asked all the time. It's like one of the what if. I think better than with Andrew Johnson, who didn't have Lincoln's empathy or sympathy or this political courage that we talk about. How much better? We don't know, because Lincoln had problems with his radical Republicans. Lincoln wanted the southern states to come back or stay in. He wanted to let them up easy, that's his term, and have them rejoin in the regular structure of government, accepting emancipation, coming up with a new constitution. And the radical Republicans were a lot more strident. The occupation of the South with troops and not allowing the return of former Confederate officers to hold public offices if you were a member of the Confederate Army and Navy.
Shelby Foote had said at one point, someone had posed a question to him of how close was the South to winning the Civil War. And he said he felt like the North fought the Civil War with one hand behind his back, and its life went on, whereas the Southerners suffered, the Northern life went on as normal. I'm curious to know if you agree with that viewpoint that the North fought with one hand behind his back. And if so, why do you think that Lincoln wouldn't have just gone all out and ended sooner?
Well, I think, did everyone hear the question on Shelby Foote and the issue of whether the North could have lost the war or the South could have won the war? First of all, I think it was very possible that the North could have lost the war. And I don't know if it's because the hand behind the back, as Shelby Foote thinks, or because of what commitments there were in the North and the South. These troops were committed to battle, Northern and Southern troops. And that right away is going to elongate the conflict. And then you did have a North, though, that did revolutionize itself, didn't you? With its industry and manufacturing and technology. And it was going to take all of that to wear down the Confederate States of America. So I think that's why it took so long. And there were some events during the war that very much frustrated Lincoln. Like in 1863, the Union had victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg within a day of each other. July 4th, General Pendleton's army surrendered to General Grant in Vicksburg, and you had the end of July 3. You had the beginning of General Lee's retreat from Gettysburg to recross the Potomac. Well, Lincoln was very, very frustrated that General Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, who had only been given the command of the Army of the Potomac 4 days before the battle began, did not follow up on his victory and bag Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. That, he thought, would have ended the war. And it would have ended the war, but can you, in hindsight, see General George Meade somehow bagging the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee? It wasn't going to happen. Yet Lincoln hoped and prayed for that, because he thought it was going to be the coup de grace to end the war through that victory and then peace negotiations. Then it got complicated because emancipation became part of any peace negotiations, and that the South would not abide by. Jeff, did you have a question?
I did. It's potentially a politically sensitive question. So let me begin with the caveat that I was in favor, or would have been, and am, in favor of the Union side. And the reason I say
You
that,
dare say that?
I'm in part, and the reason I say that is going back to an earlier question that arose over what's going on right now in the Middle East. Because it strikes me that the justification within the Civil War for a commander-in-chief to employ military force and violence against its own people, which we laud for Lincoln, is, at least on a political frame, the same that someone like Assad would use to justify his own actions. So I'm curious, not on a political frame, but as a lawyer, as a judge, where's the distinction between what Lincoln did and what, which I liked, and what Assad is doing, which I know I don't like. But what's the legal justification for you to feel that way?
To feel that Assad is doing no more than
No,
what?
the opposite. The opposite. I know that Lincoln was right. I believe Assad was wrong. But each of them has said, I'm using force to preserve my country and in order to promote the common good.
Well, it's a very good question, and one has to ask whether that civil war in Syria matches the goals in our civil war, and whether the strategy and tactics used by the president of Syria are really within the international, what we call the law of war. Using chemical weapons on your own citizens is not, it's really not within, it's outlawed by international law. Just as the Nazis, had concentration camps. So I think we're also in a global village, unlike we had during the Civil War, and what compounds this complicity is whether or not there should be third-party nations involved in issues in the Middle East, as someone here asked, I think correctly so, and that's the dilemma that we're in. And there was some concern by the Lincoln administration with an entry of Great Britain and France, and that was marginalized with the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a concern, but not nearly as great as we're confronting today in the Middle East and elsewhere. And we're going to have to come up and devise a strategy on whether this country, as a third party, should be involved with what's going on in Syria. I think that's what we're confronting now. I don't have an answer to that. I feel clearer about Iraq because I do think it was a just war, and Afghanistan after 9/11. But we're stuck there, and that's problematic, just like we are with the wars on terror. The big question that Americans have, that when they ask me about these problems, is when will it end? We want an end to these, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. Yes.
Interestingly enough, during the year, Russia, during the Civil War, sent their Navy, they parked their Navy in New York Harbor. Have we seen any deal or what there's always been suspicions there was a deal cut between the North and Russia to get the Navy to come into New York Harbor and park there?
Well, the Tsar was clearly, the Tsar of all the Russias was clearly a unionist. He was clearly in favor of the North. And there were, I think, two Russian fleets. One landed in New York and one landed in San Francisco. And it was to show support of the North. But I am not aware of any clear, diplomatic or not, discourse between the North and the Russians, although they had a Russian minister in Washington, that was going to make sure that this happened. I'm clear that the Northern administration welcomed the fleets because they were pro-North, but beyond that, I really don't know. One more, yes.
Hi, Frank.
How are you?
One thing that wasn't mentioned in Frank's credits before I get to my question is he's also president of the Ulysses Grant Association, so how many hats can one man wear? Anyway, my question is, you mentioned the Black Hawk War, which everybody believes was really critical to Lincoln's military thinking. There was another incident that struck me, his 2 trips to New Orleans by flatboat when he was a young man. Do you think that probably motivated his thinking on the importance of the rivers as far as gunboats and combined operations and so forth? Because the Union did a spectacular job in that area.
Yeah, there's no question that Lincoln's experience, you know, he spent 14 years in Spencer County in southern Indiana and was really a river rat because we were very close to the Ohio River, and then as you indicated, he did have 2 flatboat trips down. So he had a very good sense of topography and at least the value of our rivers. And I think it played a great thing in the war strategy too that the North had in dividing the Confederacy in 2. The father of orders flows unvexed to the sea, he would say, right after Grant took Pendleton's surrender. Thank you all very much. You've been great.